Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're unpacking a truly fascinating, deeply dramatic piece of history. We're talking about the story of the global labor movement. It's a tale that is just packed with incredible risk, bold resistance, and systematic organization. We're going to trace exactly how ordinary people who are facing overwhelming economic forces managed to band together to shape the fundamental structure of our modern working lives.
So, ever wonder who gave you the weekend? Or, paid holidays? Or safety regulations? It's a pretty simple question, but the answer is steeped in centuries of real struggle and incredible collective organization. These things definitely weren't just freely handed down out of the goodness of governments or employers' hearts. They were hard-won victories. Okay, let's dive into this.
But before we get into all the historical drama, we really need to define exactly what we're talking about here. The labor movement is, quite simply, the collective organization of working people to further their shared political and economic interests. At its core, it's an instance of class conflict, manifesting as trade unions and political parties working together to secure fair wages, decent conditions, and representation. It's basically about workers realizing that, hey, while they might be completely powerless on their own, together they hold immense leverage.
Section 1. The Industrial Spark.
To understand how this collective power was actually born, we have to travel back in time to the United Kingdom right at the dawn of a massive global shift. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the economy was mostly governed by the medieval guild system. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast, because these guilds actually regulated wages, set prices, and ensured standard practices. On top of that, Elizabethan-era laws empowered local parishes to fix wages so workers could maintain a competent livelihood. But then, the Industrial Revolution hit. Mechanization completely replaced cottage industries. Workers flooded into urban factory towns and real wages started falling. The government fully embraced laissez-faire economics and suddenly abandoned all those old protections. Workers were just left entirely to the mercy of a really harsh, unregulated market. The real turning point arrived right around the mid-18th century. In 1757, the British Parliament outright rescinded the Weavers' Act. This was a massive signal. The government was officially washing its hands of any responsibility for maintaining living standards. So, as food prices rose and real wages plummeted from 1760 onward, workers on the lowest rungs of society realized a pretty terrifying truth. If they were going to protect their wages and their working conditions, they were absolutely going to have to organize themselves.
Section 2. Riots and Resistance.
When people are pushed to the brink and stripped of any legal recourse, things escalate quickly. Early, localized trade unions were forced entirely into secrecy, and their tactics reflect just how desperate the situation actually was. Over in Nottinghamshire in 1811, you had the famous Luddites. These were workers who literally resorted to sabotage and machine breaking to protest their declining living standards. And because unsanctioned unions were strictly banned, workers often used these ubiquitous friendly societies as a clever cover for illegal union activities. We also saw a lot of spontaneous strikes and riots, like the ones by the Spitalfields weavers in London. Fueling all of this pushback was underground pamphleteering. Post-French Revolution, radicalism was really surging with works like Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, which inspired newly formed groups like the London Corresponding Society.
Naturally, the British government was absolutely terrified of this working-class agitation. They were terrified of a revolution, just like the one in France. This fear triggered a rapid, overwhelming wave of violent government crackdowns. Just look at this timeline. In 1799, the Combination Acts explicitly made unions illegal. By 1817, the Gagging Acts banned public gatherings altogether and suspended habeas corpus. The tension peaked violently in 1819 in Manchester, where a massive pro-labor demonstration was fired upon by authorities in the tragic Peterloo Massacre. Following that event, the government passed the Six Acts, enforcing even more draconian measures to crush the movement entirely.
Let's actually take a quick breather here from the intense early 19th century struggle. Consider this incredibly powerful idea, spoken not by some radical underground pamphleteer, but by Abraham Lincoln in 1861. He said, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor." It's such a profound philosophical anchor. Even as those early unions faced brutal, violent suppression, this fundamental idea that human labor is the true engine of all capital and deserves real dignity was steadily gaining traction on the global stage.
Section 3. The Political Shift.
As the 19th century progressed, the labor movement really started to mature.
Workers realized that, hey, localized striking and braking machines just wasn't going to be enough anymore. They actually needed to change the laws themselves. Through relentless pressure and lobbying by social reformers, organized labor finally stepped out of the shadows. In 1824 and 1825, those draconian combination acts were finally repealed. Trade unions were officially legalized in the United Kingdom. Now, while some anti-strike restrictions did stick around, this was a monumental victory. Workers finally had a legal framework to operate within, which allowed the movement to scale up in a massive way. With this newfound legal footing, we see the rise of the Chartist movement between 1838 and 1848. This was possibly the first mass working-class labor movement in the world, and their demands were considered staggering for the time. Universal male suffrage, voting by secret ballot, equal-sized constituencies, pay for members of parliament, and an end to property requirements to hold office. The crucial takeaway here is that what was considered incredibly radical and dangerous working-class agitation back then, the kind of thing that literally triggered violent government crackdowns, is just the standard, mundane blueprint for basic modern parliamentary democracy today. Funny how that works out, right?
Fast forward to the 1880s, and the movement expanded its ranks dramatically in a massive wave known as New Unionism. Up until this point, unions were mostly these exclusive clubs for highly skilled craftsmen. Well, New Unionism broke those barriers completely down. They actively recruited massive numbers of unskilled and semi-skilled workers, arguably the most vulnerable laborers in the entire economy. We're talking about bringing together the dockers, the seamen, the gas workers, and general laborers. The movement was finally becoming truly universal.
Section 4. Going global.
Capitalism wasn't just a British phenomenon, of course. It was totally global. And as industry crossed borders, the labor movement realized it had to follow suit. As the global division of labor emerged, so did the need for international coordination. In 1864, the International Workingmen's Association was founded in London. This was the very first major attempt to tackle the global realities of industrialization. Their primary issues were universal, defending the right of workers to organize literally anywhere, and launching a global campaign to finally secure the 8-hour working day.
A perfect example of how quickly this scaled is the International Transport Workers Federation, or ITF. Founded in 1896, it was sparked by coordinated strikes in major European ports like Rotterdam and Hamburg. Transport workers, seamen, dockers, railwaymen were facing appalling, genuinely dangerous conditions with ridiculously long hours and terrible pay. They realized that shipping companies could effortlessly exploit workers across different countries. By adopting the maxim that unity is strength, these massive multinational federations were born. They proved that international solidarity was literally the only way to counter a newly globalized industry.
And as the movement went global, its scope just kept widening. As noted by modern academic journals like Arbeit, Bewegung, Geschichte, which translates to labor movement history, the labor movement really didn't exist in a vacuum. It became deeply, deeply intertwined with broader social movements. The fight for fair wages naturally intersected with the history of women's liberation, and later on, anti-fascist resistance movements across Europe. The struggle for worker rights ultimately became a central pillar in the much broader fight for global human equality.
Section 5. Solidarity and Legacy. To achieve its lasting modern impact, the movement deliberately had to cross profound racial and social divides. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the incredible story of the New Orleans dock workers. In the early 20th century, right in the American Jim Crow South, a place and time of intense systemic segregation, black and white dock workers recognized a shared common threat. Employers were actively using racial divisions as a tool to pit groups against each other and drive down everyone's wages. In response to this, these dock workers formed a united front, creating what was called the 50-50 or half-and-half system. They strategically mandated that work crews be exactly half black and half white, and they agreed to stand firm on a single wage demand. It was a completely remarkable instance of biracial cooperation, defying prevailing institutional racism just to prevent wage suppression.
This intersectional solidarity was brilliantly summarized by Martin Luther King Jr., speaking back in 1961. He clearly saw that the fight for civil rights and the fight for labor rights were fundamentally linked. He profoundly pointed out that the forces exploiting workers and the forces perpetuating racism were, more often than not, the exact same entities. By understanding that labor's needs and the push for racial equality shared the exact same goals, decent wages, fair conditions, and livable housing, the movement found real, undeniable strength in absolute solidarity.
And you know, that exact solidarity is what resulted in the systemic changes that completely define our lives right now. These are the massive systemic victories of the global labor movement: the 2-day weekend, the standard 8-hour workday, minimum wage laws, paid holidays, sick leave, and health and safety regulations. We take them for granted, but these are not inherent features of a free economy. They are the direct legacy of centuries of workers organizing, striking, and negotiating for a fairer share of the wealth they created.
But of course, history isn't over. As we look at the modern landscape today, characterized by the massive influence of multinational corporations and intensely globalized trade, a huge new question emerges. With labor markets continuously shifting, what exactly is the next frontier for international collective bargaining? How is the movement going to adapt to the gig economy, or automation, or borderless digital work? It's a provocative question, and one that leaves us looking eagerly toward the future of collective power. Thank you so much for exploring this vital history with me on today's Explainer. Keep questioning the structures around you, and I'll see you next time.